Hi, I'm Lee Elliott, Global Head of Occupier Research at Knight Frank, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Craig Van Pelt, my equivalent in our North American partner, Cresa. How are you doing, Craig?
Good, Liz. Good to see you. I'm the head of research here at Cresa, and we're excited to talk a little bit about this sentiment index.
Yeah, great. So the purpose of today's conversation is to think a little bit about the occupier mindset, and that's something that has been an area of fascination and exploration for both Craig and I for a number of years now in our respective roles and our wider careers. And I suppose the sort of basis of this conversation is that our Your Space research, which we conducted last year, tended to take a sort of 3-year out view of where occupiers were aiming to get in the post-pandemic world with their real estate at both a portfolio and a workplace level. And that's great. You know, everybody's got ambition to get to an end destination in a time period. But we all know that, particularly in this world that we live in currently, that things aren't always in a straight line. And there's always challenges to sentiment, to the ability to actually get to that end destination. It's never a straightforward path. It's always twisty and turny. And one of the things that we decided to do as a house back in the first quarter of 2022 was really start to understand that short-term dynamic alongside those medium-term outlooks and give a sense of where sentiment is at any moment in time. So we've, since the first quarter of 2022, conducted a corporate real estate sentiment index, an industry first, where in our respective regions, we're canvassing the views of about 100 corporate real estate leaders every quarter or every 6 months, and trying to get a sense of where the mindset is at. And that's what Craig and I are going to speak about today. Craig, what's your overarching sort of impression of where the occupier mindset is at in North America at this moment in time?
Yeah, I think it is still reactionary to the events of the pandemic. It's a little bit of a mix because we are still waiting for the other shoe to drop in terms of the economy. Yet we're still creating jobs. There is still some positive sentiment out there, but it's still cautionary. Right? People are still waiting for the smoke to clear to make long term strategic decisions because real estate is a long term strategic decision, and headcount drives that demand. And I think people and companies and leaders and organizations are still waiting to kind of see where everything shakes out.
Yeah, that's really interesting because there's a number of themes immediately we can pick up on there. But I think, on my view of the overall sentiment in the Asia Pac and EMEA regions is similar. That we've got occupiers that are recognizing things are perhaps not as grave as perhaps were anticipated at the start of 2023 when global recession was very much the sort of watchword. Everybody was concerned about how long and how deep that global recession might be. And we've kind of averted that. But it hasn't really been back into a growth mindset that's really driven occupier sentiment positive. If you look at occupier sentiment in from Asian and European respondents, we've still got a pretty neutral mindset. We're not really super positive. We're not really super negative. And we've been bundling along at that rate for probably the last 5 or 6 quarters. There's obviously quarter movement, but generally the mindset has been moderate, cautionary, as you say, and perhaps a little bit fragile as well. My sense is that corporate sentiment is there to be pushed around a little bit by macro events, and we've got a few of those upcoming, not least in the political sphere in both parts of the world going forward. Something we might come back to. If we look at the sentiment index as we've constructed it, we've got the overall picture of sentiment, but the sentiment index also breaks down into sort of 3 subcomponents, looking at 3 different dynamics: the growth dynamic, the portfolio dynamic, and then the workplace dynamic. And I wanted to just sort of explore that with you a little bit, Craig, if I may. You've already touched upon the US economy still generating jobs and in more positive state than perhaps we may have anticipated. It's interesting when you look at the growth dynamic in the sentiment index. There is a growing positivity about the global economic outlook. Quarter on quarter, it's nudging up. how do you see that playing out over the course of the rest of the year?
Well, I think it's really interesting. Like I said, unemployment here is still near record lows. We are still adding jobs, but if you scratch the surface on that, what are the jobs that we're adding? And a lot of them are in service related roles in healthcare. The knowledge worker or typical office occupying jobs have certainly slowed in the last year, and not retracted, but I would say they're at below even pre-pandemic kind of growth levels.
Yeah.
So I think because of that, and demand is certainly a little bit curbed even more than it would be due to other issues surrounding return to office and occupancy levels in general.
Yeah.
I think hiring is not something that a lot of companies are really thinking about right now. I think it's efficiently and effectively using your workforce and deciding maybe we're going to wait a little bit and see what happens before we think about headcount. And that's kind of what the sentiment survey said. Headcount doesn't look, a lot of companies are not looking to raise headcount in the next 6 months, although they're generally optimistic about the economy. So there's a bit of a paradox.
Yeah, and that's something we've absolutely seen in the European and Asian numbers too. What we've seen is relatively moderate sentiment about future headcount growth, but actually very positive sentiment about revenue growth at a corporate level. Mm-hmm. And that would point to, as you've alluded to, more efficiency, more focus on productivity. We're hearing a lot more now from occupiers as they've come out of the defensive occupier mindset that we had during the pandemic, which was all about survival. We're now seeing much more discussion about using transformative technology, particularly AI, to drive efficiency, to drive productivity without adding to headcount. And of course, that will ultimately shape real estate portfolios. I don't think we're there yet, but certainly that reshaping of portfolios, right-sizing of portfolios, if you like, is probably likely to occur. Now, one of the reasons I think we're not there yet is firstly that technology is still being rolled out and applied, and people are trying to figure out the impacts it might have on their corporate structures and what the jobs that people do, if you like. But I think the other one that's very clear in our sentiment index, and I'd be interested in what you're seeing on the other side of the pond, is capital expenditure constraints. We had a really interesting sort of end of Q4 2023, when suddenly all the respondents in Asia and EMEA sort of pointed to a much more expansive use of capital and capital expenditure to drive growth and support real estate activity. And then that suddenly just sort of disappeared in the first 2 quarters of this year, as we've seen occupiers, I think, probably protecting balance sheets a little bit and putting the brakes on capital expenditure. And that, of course, has huge implications for real estate activity, whether it's relocations or whether it's sort of investing heavily in sort of workplaces. What does that chime with what you're seeing?
Yeah, it really does. And I think if we look a little bit closer, you did see more favorable sentiment a year ago around capital expenditures, and I think you could argue certainly that companies shot their shot, right? They spent some of that money last year to help increase efficiencies and make amenities more available to employees, and if I'm being honest, it's probably a little bit of, hey, we do spend all this money and yet our occupancy levels haven't really changed in a meaningful way. So is that worth spending, that kind of money within the office space to improve it? And I think maybe you're seeing a little bit of that sentiment saying, all right, well, we spent the money, let's see how this, and if it works, and before we spend more money.
Right. Yeah. And I definitely, the brakes on capital expenditure are impacting fit out, impacting relocation. And as you say, I think having spent a lot and invested a lot of time in driving a more positive workplace experience through investing in the workplaces that many organizations presently have, I almost sense that corporate real estate leaders have kind of got to the end of their tether a little bit with that particular dynamic. And we're now in the world a little bit of mandating returns to office and all the emotion and discussion that brings. if you sort of look at sentiment, and as we've said already a couple of times, it's very much about driving efficiency and driving resilience, I suppose, in a post-pandemic world. One of the things that we're seeing from Asian and European respondents to the survey is offshoring coming back up on the radar. In fact, if you look at our quarterly observations of sentiment, we've seen 3 quarters of increased positive sentiment around offshoring. There's no doubt that occupiers in both of those geographies, Europe and Asia, are thinking more about relocating what may have traditionally been called back or middle office functions, but actually now are much more advanced than that. It's digital platforms, all kinds of sort of technology-driven business functions. What's the sort of the dynamic on your side of the water?
It's a little bit backwards from that, I think, generally speaking, only because, and I'm not going to get into supply chains and disruptions over COVID, because I think that was one thing that really impacted decision making in terms of where to locate your back office kind of things from an office perspective. And I think we've seen a lot more companies think of doing more onshoring or even nearshoring, if you will, just because it removes some of the complexities involved. And it's already very, very complex. And if you can remove some of those, I think it behooves organizations to think that way. And I think we've seen a little bit of that protectionist, nationalistic view in the United States and North America in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned complexity, because of course the watchword or the subtitle of the third edition of Your Space was managing complexity, and that's exactly what's going on. I think you raise a really interesting point. There is a distinction here clearly between office functionality and that being offshored versus production distribution type functionality, which has definitely been pushed along by a wave of nearshoring or reshoring. Whether that's aided by politics or otherwise, we'll leave for another time. But I think that dynamic is really interesting, and we've certainly seen in the context of the Asian markets and to a degree Europe, Malaysia, India, Central and Eastern Europe, sort of coming up on the radar now increasingly. Not necessarily people put in functions there right now, but certainly thinking about that more as an efficiency play. As a labor arbitrage, but also as an ability to access talent that perhaps might not be in the sorts of volumes that we would like in more established markets, or where that talent's being really fought for.
Right. And one thing I might add about North America, I've seen we had a really big movement in the 2000s, early 2010s about back to the city, back from the suburbs, back to the urban environments, because that is where the talent was. But I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is suburban office spaces have become kind of winners because they're close to a lot of workers. They're easy to get to. It's a U.S. problem, or not a problem, but lots of parking, right, for people out in the suburbs. And because of availabilities, it's becoming much more reasonable to lease space in the suburbs as opposed to the city center. And I think that is, at least regionally in the United States, that has been a movement or a trend that we've certainly seen in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting contrast, because I personally don't see that in Europe and Asia to anywhere near the same extent, and there may be lots of cultural reasons for that, but certainly our gravitational pull is towards CBD markets, undoubtedly business parks, a little more challenged despite some of the benefits they bring around parking and the like. What we've got, I think, at the moment is a very clear contrast between that long-term ambition that I mentioned at the beginning and the short-term ability to act. And I think what that's playing out in real estate behavior at the moment is, if there are near-term lease events, expiries, breaks, particularly expiries, we're generally seeing occupiers renewing or re-gearing, either because there's an absence of quality stock to take in the market, particularly in CBD markets, or because they just don't have the conviction right now, because they don't have sufficient signals around the direction of travel on occupancy, for example. What's your sense of that sort of dynamic in the US? Have you seen a lot more renewal?
Generally speaking, yes. I think it's a little bit, we'd say over here, kicking the can down the road a little
Right.
bit until it becomes a little bit clearer. But overall, we're not through all of those pre-COVID leases rolling. We're probably 60. We were just having this discussion internally the other day. We're probably 60 to 70% through those leases that were signed pre-pandemic. And as those continue to roll, I think we will see certainly more renewals. Or what we've also seen is just right sizing, taking less space and more well amenitized flight to quality, which is the theme. I'm sure you've seen it all over the world as well.
Yeah.
Is if you're not going to spend the same amount of money on a larger footprint, maybe you'll reinvest some of that capital in a smaller space in a better, well amenitized location.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad you mentioned flight to quality because you can't move for the expression in most real estate podcasts and reports
Yeah.
these days. It'd be remiss of us not to talk about it a little bit. One of the things I've been trying to talk to audiences about when we presented your space to them is what do we actually mean by flight to quality? And I break it down into, I'm sure there are other dynamics that one could point to, but I break it down into sort of three distinct flights. A flight to more flexible space, whether that is co-working space, and interestingly, the observations from the European market are that we are seeing more corporate occupiers taking co-working, managed service spaces than ever before. And even if it's conventional space, the leases tend to have a lot more flexibility and short-termism in them than has traditionally been the case. So there's a flight to flex. There's a flight to sustainable real estate, i.e. spaces that have accreditations or certifications. And then a flight, as you mentioned, to amenity-rich space to support that return to office and create a more compelling environment for an experience for occupants. It seems to me, and looking at the data that we have, and I've seen side of your data, the flight to sustainability piece in the US is probably not as foremost in the occupier mindset as it might be in Europe and Asia. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think generally the United States is trailing the rest of the world in terms of how much, I don't want, importance is the wrong word, because sustainability is incredibly important to any organization that wants to do business in the world. Not just because of that, but it's the right thing to do. So I think, if you read the question, it says you have to remember it's in the next 6 months. So maybe, and it is, we have a fairly neutral to negative kind of response from the survey about how much weight are you putting into sustainability. I know it's important to organizations, but I think at this point they're also thinking about, hey, what can we do and what do we need to do to right size our space, and then we will vote. And that is part of it, the long term solution certainly, but in the short term, I think it's maybe not given as much weight as it is in some other parts of the world.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to make because we're gauging sentiment around some very narrow elements, and if you take something like sustainability, it's obviously much bigger than taking a building that's got a certification, which is the bit we're kind of exploring. And I think there's a lot of in operation type activity that companies can and are doing around ESG, which broadens that discussion and that debate. So, but we're certainly seeing, we talked about constraints earlier, capital expenditure being a constraint. One of the constraints we're seeing in Europe and Asia to an extent is the lack of certified buildings that actually enable that move towards more green buildings or more sustainable buildings. And I think that's even if capital expenditure starts to improve, I still think that's going to be a break on the extent to which occupiers can really move. Just finally, I know Cresa have recently moved to a new shiny HQ in Chicago. Looking forward to getting there at some point. And not least because it's got a basketball court, although
that's right.
My basketball's not great, but it's there to be improved. You've clearly grappled with that sort of dynamic of taking more amenitized space as an organization. That's consistent with what you're seeing across the occupier base?
It is. It's an investment in your people, right? And I think it's an investment in the time and energy they spend in the office and with each other. And it's important that they are comfortable and happy, right, where they're working. And we actually started that project a couple of years back, and it turned out really well. and we've had pretty good return to the office back in Chicago, and I have to believe that part of that is because we have such a wonderful place to be.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
certainly helps with that. Yeah, it's certainly true that amenitized space has a lot of value and it increases the experience. Time will tell how much of that, what that return on investment will be if you can measure it in some way. But I certainly think it is in some ways table stakes, what you might say, for getting employees to engage and come back to the
yeah.
office on a more regular basis.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a good point at which to perhaps close out the conversation. And when we look at amenity, one of the things that I sort of grapple with a little bit is that we have seen this push to amenity-rich buildings, but we're now getting to a point where the very best-in-class buildings in and around Europe and Asia are pretty heavily amenitized, and it's hard to investigate or explore or understand what's next in terms of that roster of amenity. I mean, I've said for a number of years now that I think educational amenity, town hall spaces, bleacher spaces, and educational programs are going to be really critical in a world that's upskilling and reskilling. But I actually think we might have started to hit a bit of a ceiling on amenity, notwithstanding the point we've already made about capital expenditure. And I think the bigger issue for driving the occupational markets is going to be actually how do you bring some of those inferior buildings that are going to be around because of the embedded carbon and the fact that they need to be part of our built environment going forward. How do you bring them up to standard? And I almost see that sort of dynamic starting to shift a little bit before us. I'm sat here in London. It's definitely a discussion that we see in the London market all of the time. What's your sort of takeaway for the next 6 months, Craig, in terms of the North American occupational market dynamic?
I think for the next 6 months, it will be pretty stable from where we are right now. I don't think there's going to be a lot of change, and there's several reasons for that, including this is an election here in the United States, and companies usually, I don't want to say use it as an excuse, but there's a lot of waiting to see what happens in an election in terms of the decisions might make moving forward. So and I don't see any big events. I don't believe we're going to get into a recession this year. But I also think we're not going to see a lot of big GDP growth. I think it's going to be a little bit boring, which is good. We can use boring.
After the couple of years we've had, we can definitely do with boring. Yeah.
Yeah, I just think it's going to be a pretty stable year in terms of the occupier viewpoint of things until we know a little bit more and some more of these leases begin to roll. Because I think that again, we're not going to have a real picture of where we are or where the bottom is, or if we've reached the bottom of the corporate, the commercial real estate market on the office side. Maybe for another 24, 36 months, and then we'll look back and understand it a little bit better. But we're still really in the middle of it. But
yeah, I mean, I think the political point's an interesting one. We won't get into the actual shades of those debates, but 80% of the world's population facing up to some sort of democratic decision over the course of this year. That's got to be a little bit of a break on corporate behaviour. They'll want to see how that plays out. So I agree with you. I think this year is probably a year where we're a little bit more sedate, where we do start to get some more signals from the way that people are returning to the office and what that means for long-term occupancy. And thereafter, I think we start to get some real behaviour and behavioural changes around sort of mixing up the portfolio, right sizing, changing the corporate map, all those exciting things that we can't wait to get stuck into. Craig, thanks very much for joining me. It's always a delight to talk to you and get your perspective from the American market. And I hope that we can do that again in the near future.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Lee. Good seeing you.
Thank you.